Paris, known as the City of Lights, has always been a symbol of romance, beauty, and everlasting love. But for Sophie Duval, its shining streets, cozy cafes, and breathtaking monuments had become a painful reminder of the tangled web of lies she had woven over the past few months. Sophie sat at an elegantly set table inside Label EPO, one of Paris's finest restaurants, with her lover, Lucas Bont. The air was rich with the scent of gourmet food, and the soft clinking of wine glasses filled the background. Yet for Sophie, the luxury of the evening couldn't hide the anxiety gnawing at her chest. At 35, Sophie was everything a man could dream of: radiant, intelligent, and sophisticated. Born and raised in Lyon, she moved to Paris in her mid-20s after marrying Alexander Duval, the man who had been the love of her life for the longest time. Alexander, 3 years older than her, was a world-renowned architect celebrated for his innovative designs that perfectly blended modernity with France's historical charm. Their love story had been a whirlwind. They met at a café near the Seine, where Alexander started a conversation with Sophie about the history of architecture, a passion they both shared. That conversation led to a relationship and, soon after, a marriage that seemed perfect from the outside. They were Paris's golden couple, charming, successful, and living in a beautiful apartment overlooking the river. Their life was enviable, filled with lavish trips to the south of France, weekends spent with intellectuals and artists, and extravagant parties where Alexander's architectural models and designs decorated the walls. But beneath the surface, Sophie felt a growing sense of restlessness. The excitement and passion that had once defined their relationship had faded into a routine life, suffocated by the pressures of Alexander's career and their carefully curated public image. Then came Lucas Beaumont. Lucas, 42, was a businessman with a rugged charm that couldn't be confined to the corporate world. He had a natural magnetism, the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately capture attention without even trying. His sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and athletic build turned heads wherever he went. Sophie first met him at a gallery opening, introduced by a mutual friend. From the moment Lucas kissed her hand, something inside Sophie sparked. He was everything Alexander wasn't: daring, spontaneous, and exciting. Where Alexander was thoughtful and deliberate, Lucas was reckless and impulsive. Their flirtation started innocently with charming conversations over champagne and playful banter at social events. But it didn't take long for their connection to deepen. Sophie found herself yearning for Lucas, craving the thrill and unpredictability he brought into her life. One evening, after too much wine and too many stolen glances, their flirtation turned into an affair. The guilt gnawed at Sophie, but she couldn't stop. With Lucas, she felt alive, as if she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been buried under the weight of her marriage. So, the affair continued for months. Sophie lived a double life, carefully balancing her role as Alexander's devoted wife and her passionate escapades with Lucas. She knew it was wrong, but the thrill was intoxicating. Alexander, ever the workaholic, seemed too distracted to notice, or so she thought. Tonight, as Sophie sat across from Lucas at Label EPO, something felt different. The evening had started as it always did: playful flirtation over expensive wine and perfectly cooked dishes. Lucas, as usual, was in high spirits, laughing and making light conversation about his latest business venture. But Sophie felt a tension in the air she couldn't explain. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his usual smug grin on his face. "You're quiet tonight, Sophie. Everything okay?" he asked, reaching out to brush her hand with his fingers. Sophie forced a smile. "I'm fine, just thinking, that's all." "About what?" he asked, his gaze softening. "Life," she replied, her voice trailing off as she glanced out the window. The streets of Paris were alive with evening activity, but instead of feeling the usual comfort the city brought her, Sophie felt exposed, as if the walls were closing in on her. Lucas raised an eyebrow, but before he could press further, Sophie's phone, which had been resting beside her wine glass, buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, fully expecting it to be an email or message from a friend. But when she saw the name that flashed across the screen, her blood ran cold. It was a message from Alexander. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the phone, her heart racing. The message was brief, but it hit her like a punch to the gut. "Enjoy the wine, Sophie. I hope it tastes better than betrayal." The blood drained from her face. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the message again, disbelief washing over her. How did he know? Her heart pounded, panic rising in her chest. She could feel Lucas's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "Everything okay?" Lucas asked, his tone shifting from playful to concerned. Sophie quickly turned her phone over, hiding the message from view. She forced a smile, but her mind was racing. "It's nothing," she lied, her voice betraying her unease. Lucas didn't press further, but Sophie could tell he wasn't convinced. She tried to focus on the conversation, the dinner, anything but the message. But then her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the quiet restaurant like a knife. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to face whatever message Alexander had sent next, but her hand moved involuntarily, unlocking the phone again. Another message: "You always said you loved French cuisine. I wonder if you'll enjoy it as much when your life falls apart. Look around, Sophie. Do you feel safe?" Her throat tightened. She glanced around the restaurant, her eyes scanning the faces of the other diners. Was Alexander here? Was he watching them? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Lucas noticed her growing distress. "Sophie, what's going on? You're acting strange." "I need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she pushed her chair back. Lucas frowned, confusion written across his face.
"What? Why?"
"What's happening?" Sophie stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She couldn't explain it to Lucas. How could she tell him that her carefully constructed world was falling apart, that Alexander, the man she thought she had fooled, knew everything? But before she could move, her phone buzzed again. She knew she should ignore it, but she couldn't resist the urge to look. The message that greeted her this time made her stomach drop. "By the time you return home, I'll be gone. And so will the life you've been living. Consider this your last meal as Mrs. Duval." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as the weight of Alexander's words sank in. He wasn't bluffing. He knew about the affair, and he was leaving her. All at once, the reality of her situation hit her. She had lost Alexander. She had lost everything. Lucas stood up, alarmed by her sudden change in demeanor. "Sophie, talk to me. What's going on?" But Sophie couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, her chest constricted with fear and regret. Without another word, she turned and fled the restaurant, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she pushed through the doors and into the cool night air. The streets of Paris were quieter now, the bustling crowds of the evening having thinned out as the night wore on. Sophie walked briskly down the cobblestone streets, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She couldn't go home. She couldn't face the empty apartment, the reality of what she had done. She had betrayed the man who had given her everything, and now she was left with nothing. She wandered aimlessly through the city, her tears blurring the lights of the street lamps and storefronts. Memories of her life with Alexander flooded her mind. Their wedding day, the trips they took together, the quiet mornings spent in each other's arms. How had it all gone so wrong? Sophie had always believed she could have it all. She thought she could love Alexander and have her affair with Lucas without facing any consequences. But now, she realized how foolish she had been. She had taken Alexander's love for granted, assuming he would never find out, never leave her. But now, she was alone. And the worst part was, she knew she had no one to blame but herself. She found herself standing at the edge of the Seine, staring at the dark waters that reflected the twinkling lights of the city. The river, so calm and serene, seemed to mock her. Everything in Paris had once felt like a fairy tale, but now it felt hollow and unforgiving. Her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. She hesitated before looking at it, her heart sinking as she read the final message from Alexander. "Goodbye, Sophie. I hope you find what you're looking for. You won't find it with him, or in the life you've been leading, but I hope one day you'll understand what you've lost. And with that, it was over. Alexander was gone.